Everybody, it's that time. We're in 2 Samuel chapter 1. And we are camping out for a bit on David's elegy for Saul. Mainly because this has there's multiple things going on with this elegy. David, of course, is composing it for his own lamentation over Saul and Jonathan. But we've also seen that it's been written and recorded for a broader public purpose. In fact, we'll talk a little bit more about that, Lord willing, in today's class. The instructions, or the text tells us that he wants, we talked about this on Thursday, that he wants bow taught to the people of Judah. And the idea there is probably not that we've got this random aside where he's telling us that he wants, we're in the middle of this lamentation and just randomly, okay, we also want kids to learn how to shoot. And then back to the poem. That more than likely what's going on is that if bow fits in here at all, it's the title of the elegy that he has composed, that in the context, what he wants taught to the people of Judah is the elegy that we're reading. And then the Spirit has recorded it for us. So we'll talk more about the implications of that a little later on. But we're camping out on this for a while because not only do we have that going on, what David is doing with this elegy, but as we've said, the prophets, the ones who have written, put together the book of Samuel, have a purpose in recording this poem. And I think that it acts like Hannah's prayer, in that it ties together some of the big overarching themes of the story. This poem, being in the middle of Samuel, is going to point backwards, and it's also going to point forwards. It's going to tie some things together. So it is an important enough section that we're really going to camp out on it for a while. Talked about it on Thursday. I'm not sure if we will finish talking about it this morning. Lord willing, no later than Thursday, though. All right, so let's read the elegy together again. 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 17, and then we'll go to the Lord in prayer and begin our study. David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and Jonathan his son, and he said it should be taught to the people of Judah. Behold, it is written in the book of Jashar. He said, "Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely. In life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain in your high places. I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished." All right, so we have covered all of the major sections of the elegy. So we start out with elegy proper. He's mourning what is going on. He declares his theme that those first lines, "Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen." He curses Mount Gilboa. Then he begins eulogizing Jonathan and Saul. He eulogizes them together in verses 22 and 23. And where we left off on Thursday was we're noticing just how some of the things that David says in this elegy maybe were not the things that we would have chosen to say if we were responsible for composing this elegy, based on all of the things that we have read in the story. Like Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely. Like we could imagine him saying that about Jonathan. But Saul, well, wait a minute now. In life and in death, they were not divided. Well, we've seen plenty of instances in this story where they have been divided. So what is going on in this elegy? That's what we finished with on Thursday. I'm bringing that question up again so that we can suspend it for a little bit as we're finishing the elegy. And at the end, we'll talk about what is going on here. So, what is left for us in the elegy, verses 24, 25, 26, and 27. Here, David is closing his elegy by mourning Saul and Jonathan individually. And this kind of, it pushes that question, I guess, a little harder, because if it was Saul and Jonathan together, right, we might say that Saul is hanging on to Jonathan's coattails in this elegy. Though of course David is going to praise Jonathan, and Saul gets to ride along. But here, David splits them up in his consideration, and he gives Saul individual consideration. In fact, gives him first individual consideration. We've got two parallel stanzas here at the end of the poem. For Saul, he says, "You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle." Then for Jonathan, he says, "Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished." And we can see the parallels between these two stanzas. They both close with this refrain, "How the mighty have fallen." They both talk about mourning, right? Israel mourning Saul, David mourning Jonathan. So he is considering them separately, still paralleling them in the way that he's considering them. So let's start with Saul. David invokes the daughters of Israel to weep over Saul. Now we can remember only one other time in Samuel that the daughters of Israel have had anything to say about Saul. And it turns into a rather infamous refrain throughout the book. Remember, if you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 6. This is after David defeated Goliath, after they've defeated the Philistines. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, "Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s." We remember the disastrous effect that those lines have on the rest of the story. The elegy flips that situation on its head. David has invoked the women of Israel to sing again over Saul. But there, Saul was returning victorious from defeating the Philistines. And the women celebrated that in a way that made Saul feel slighted. So what are they doing, saying that David is slain more than me? Now he's going to have the kingdom. We remember his overreaction to that, which turned out to be correct. But here, Saul has been slain by the Philistines, and the women are to mourn him and to honor him for his blessings as king. Weep over him who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. And at this point, the elegy might have us really confused or have alarm bells going off in our heads. So, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. This is the first that we have learned of this. And we're left to wonder, or based on the history that we have been told up to this point, did Saul really bless Israel in this way? Is this an aspect of the story that has not been focused on up to this point? Did Israel really prosper under Saul? And did they really love Saul? Again, the story has been relatively silent up to this point, and a lot of time has passed. I think I've mentioned this a few times, but we've not actually gotten around to reading it. You go to Acts 13. I want to pull in the sole New Testament reference that we have to King Saul. Now, before we consider this, based just on Samuel, what we have read in 1 Samuel, how long do you think Saul has been king? Right, you might already know the answer to this, the answer that doesn't come from 1 Samuel. But how long does it seem like Saul has been king? Do y'all remember the text telling us anywhere where Saul, like the number of years Saul has been king? There's like one place at, I want to say it's maybe the beginning of chapter 15, or maybe it's at the beginning of chapter 13, where it tells us that part of the story is happening 2 years into his reign. But we've not been told how long the rest of his reign has been. We might be given to think, oh, this has all gone by rather quickly. David's been on the run in the wilderness, and all of this stuff has resolved itself pretty quickly. Paul, in preaching his sermon in Acts 13, is the only person to tell us a definitive number for the reign of King Saul. And we'll just get that number. Acts 13, verse 21. This is the Apostle Paul speaking. Then they asked for a king, and God gave them Saul, the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years. And you've probably heard that number before, that there's this correspondence between Saul, David, and Solomon. Right? They each reign for 40 years. So, nice little mnemonic device for remembering that. 3 kings, 40 years each. This is the only place in Scripture where we learn that. So, there has been a lot of Saul's story that the text has not reported to us. Again, 40 years worth of material, and we've seen the material that the prophets have seen fit to record to us. The Spirit has seen fit to record for us. It is possible, perhaps, that over the course of Saul's years, from a conventional standpoint, he has been a successful king. We should remember, however, Samuel's warning in 1 Samuel chapter 8, that the king is going to take all of Israel's stuff. Right? That's the general thrust of that warning. Right? The king's going to take your sons and your daughters and make them servants. He's going to make them commanders over his soldiers. He's going to take some of your fields. He's going to take your crops. He's going to take all of this and all of that. So we've received that warning. And the one time that we have seen Saul attempt to bring spoil back to the country was his disastrous campaign against the Amalekites, where he wasn't supposed to bring back spoil. Apart from that, we've not really seen any kind of spoiling activity. So we might be left to wonder what the book is doing with these words. David, at least, seems to be saying all of this honestly and sincerely. And the elegy hems us into that by pairing Saul with Jonathan. We can't just say that, well, David's either blowing smoke here, or he's being ironic, or he's just being nice. Because if we are going to say that he's being ironic about Saul, right, that damages what he says about Jonathan. If we imagine that he's kind of stretching things in one stanza of the poem, and then the other stanza of the poem is super, super sincere. And of course, this is the honest truth about Jonathan. Everything about Saul is just that he's made that up or exaggerated it. So we're given this praise of Saul and this instruction that the daughters of Israel to weep over him. Now, Jonathan receives the most elevated language of the whole elegy, and this makes sense to us. As we said, Saul is to be mourned by Israel, but David declares his personal lament over Jonathan. And someone recently in class had asked, well, why did Jonathan die in this battle? Like, Jonathan's not done anything that we have seen that would make us think that he needs to die in this battle. It kind of seems wrong to us for Jonathan to die in the same battle as Saul. So of course Saul had to die on Mount Gilboa. But why Jonathan? And we said at the time that the text is silent on that matter, and it leaves us perplexed by it. Like, we never get an explanation for why Jonathan is dead. But we should take comfort in knowing that we're in good company, because David is likewise perplexed. He doesn't ascribe any kind of meaning or greater purpose to Jonathan's death. All he can do is express his own distress that Jonathan is dead, and express the closeness of his relationship with Jonathan, or he calls him his brother. He says that Jonathan's love was a wonder to him. The ESV is, your love to me was extraordinary. It's the word for a wonder, like the same language that's used elsewhere to describe God's mighty works. That kind of wonder. It wouldn't be inappropriate to paraphrase David's words as, your love was a miracle to me. That's the sentiment that he's putting across with this language. And it's so extraordinary, Jonathan's love was, that David declares that his love, that Jonathan's love, meant more to him than, our text typically just says the love of women. And it has, I think, led some people to take this comparison in some unfruitful directions. This is the big passage that has certain people out particularly in the denominational world, questioning whether David was gay, for example. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. Because in English, that phrase, the love of women, just for some reason has some sexual connotation to it. Again, just in English. And that is obviously not what David is getting at in this elegy. Now, if we understand that he's not talking about sexual love, well, what kind of love is he experiencing from women? And again, this is one of the weaknesses of English, is that when we say it surpasses the love of women, we think David is just talking about his relationships with women generally. I think it's worth it for us to remember that in Hebrew as well as in Greek, they generally didn't... So the words for men and women are also used to signify husbands and wives. And I think what David is getting at here is that Jonathan's love for him, the relationship that they shared, was to him greater even than the relationship that he shared with his own wives. Jonathan's love for him was more important to him even than the love of his own wives. I think that's probably the best sense to make of this comparison. But it tells you just how incredibly close David and Jonathan were, just how much David valued Jonathan. Because it's not like David doesn't like his wives. We've just seen proof of that. He's just chased down an Amalekite raiding band to get his wives back. All right, so that's the close. Louise, and we've got the microphone coming up.
I was just going to say that the love surpassed his own father, because Jonathan
Yeah.
went against his father's probably wishes if he had only known that he saved David's life. I mean, that's pretty impressive.
And Saul makes that clear, that he is displeased with what Jonathan has done for David. And that's why they have to come up with this whole scheme where, at the New Moon Festival, Jonathan is waiting to see what his father's reaction is to learning that David is not going to be there. Yeah, Jonathan was extraordinarily devoted to David. Jason?
Well, he calls him his brother.
Yeah.
Just a few words before that. So obviously he's talking about a different kind of love than sexual nature.
Exactly, yeah.
But the love of a man and a woman, or a husband and a wife, is a way where you can be unguarded. You can deal with your spouse in a way where you're more vulnerable, or you might do things that you don't carry yourself that way when you deal with the rest of the world.
Not generally, yeah.
So, that relationship that they have is the kind of intimate relationship, not in a sexual way, but the way
Right.
a husband and wife can be, and it surpasses even that as well.
Yeah, it can be open and vulnerable, and we've certainly seen that between David and Jonathan, haven't we? We recall Jonathan investing David in his princely clothes, and we remember how vulnerable David was as he was sitting out in the field waiting for Jonathan to report to him what happened at that new moon feast. So that's very good. And it brings us to I guess one of the weaknesses of English is that whenever we start talking about an intimate relationship, for some reason in English our minds tend to jump immediately to a certain kind of intimacy. Whereas what we mean is just that they are very, very close in the sense that they can be open and vulnerable with one another. So, excellent. Okay, so we'll come down to the general question here. Or actually, any other questions or comments on these last couple of stanzas of the Elegy? Okay, so the general thing. What strikes us about the way that David remembers Saul in particular in this elegy? And in particular, is this the way that we normally remember Saul? Now think about the ways that we typically talk about Saul, what we remember him for. And you look at the way that David talks about Saul, the way that David remembers him. And we noted that even the narrator does this with Saul as well. At the end of chapter 31, the prophets could have ended Saul's story with the humiliation of his corpse on the walls of Bet-Shan. That could have just been that's it, the end for Saul. But it doesn't end at that point. Instead, we're left with a reminder of the high point of Saul's career, his faithful rescue of Jabesh-Gilead from the hands of Nahash the Ammonite. And so the men of Jabesh, we suppose out of gratitude, sneak into the now Philistine territory, what was a captured city from Israel. They sneak into Philistine territory in a daring nighttime raid, and they take Jonathan's body down from the wall along with the bodies of his sons, and they give them a proper burial. The book is going to do something more with that a little later on, by the way. This is not the last that we've heard of this. Not the last that we've heard of Jabesh-Gilead. Also not the last that we have heard of Nahash the Ammonite. He's going to come back in a surprising way. But for now, I want us to notice that the book concludes Saul's story with the bravery of the men of Jabesh-Gilead. And then it immediately follows that up with the story of David putting the Amalekite to death. Remember this Amalekite who comes in and says that he's the one that put Saul out of his misery at the beginning of 2 Samuel chapter 1. And David punishes him because he would dare even to claim to have raised his hand against the Lord's anointed. So we've got those two things, and then immediately after those, we have this elegy, where David paints a very rosy picture of Saul's career. And I think the book combines those elements of the story with this elegy for a purpose. David, I think one of the things that's going on in this elegy is that David reminds us that no one can safely raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. And then he lives out that principle, not only with his deeds, but also with his words. So even in remembering the dead King Saul, David will not assault the Lord's anointed. And this seems to be more than just David refusing to speak ill of the dead, although I think that is a lesson that we should take from this. You would think if you could speak ill of any deceased person, it would be someone like Saul. But David will not. I mean, this is the way, it's more than just that, though. This is the way that David wants Saul remembered perpetually in Judah, if we understand that he wants this elegy taught to the sons of Judah. And he has it written down, all of our English translations say it's written in the book of Jashar, which I don't know why we transliterate Jashar as a proper name instead of just translating it. Behold, it is written in the book of the upright. This elegy is recorded in a book called the Book of the Righteous, or the Book of the Straight, the Book of the Upright, which is not where you would expect to read about Saul. But that's where David has this recorded. What's going on in this elegy, at least it strikes me as similar to the experience of reading Hebrews 11, which is all about these victories won by faith, and then it surprisingly includes the stories of Jephthah and Samson. And I don't know if you've ever read Hebrews 11 this way, where by the time you get to the end of the Hebrew writer's list, you're like surprised at the people that he's mentioning. Because again, Hebrews 11 is, we call it the Faith Hall of Fame. Right? By faith, all of this was done, all of that was done. And then at the end, we're getting Jephthah and Gideon and Samson. If I remember correctly, he also mentions Barak. And it's like, what are those guys doing in this list? Now, the comparison is just that it's surprising to see it happen. We're not saying that Saul was any kind of model of faith. David's not saying that Saul was a model of faith. Just that it is surprising to find these people treated in this way, despite all of the things that we know about them from elsewhere in the Bible. And all of this suggests that maybe we ought to reevaluate the way that we generalize the reign of King Saul. And we've talked before about our tendency to try to lump kings into good kings versus bad kings. And what we're doing when we do that is we are flattening them out. It's not a fruitful way of remembering many of these men. Because on the one hand, whenever we flatten people out into here's the list of good kings and here's the list of bad kings, it leads us to lionize men like David and Solomon, who were quite capable of very wicked things, as we will see in our study. But it also leads us to demonize men like Saul, because he was, for all of his many, many flaws, still the Lord's anointed. He was God's choice to be Israel's first king. And the Spirit of God rested on him until after his sin with Amalek. And that might surprise us too, that it's not until after Amalek that God removes his Spirit from Saul. Not back in chapter 13, at the Battle of Michmash, whenever Saul asserts himself and makes the sacrifice. Even at that point, God leaves his Spirit on him. We don't have to ignore any of the many wicked things that Saul did, to remember the things that the Scriptures record in his favor, including some of the righteous things that he did. In other words, I guess the basic question is, do we believe that King Saul was a real person or not? And what I mean is this. I don't mean, do we believe that he existed? We do this with biblical characters sometimes. When we ask, do you think he was real? We mean, do you think he existed or not? We all believe that King Saul existed. The challenge for us is believing not only that he existed, but that he was actually a human being. That is, he was a real person. Because real people aren't flat. Right? Real people, like David and Solomon, and like Saul, real people real people are complex. Right? Let me ask it this way. Do you think that you personally could be lumped into a list of good people versus bad people? I hope you recognize that would be flattening yourself out way more than you actually are. Excuse me. So, again, Saul is not a model by any means. Definitely not a positive model. But at the same time, is he a Pharaoh, or an Eglon, or a Nahash, or an Ahab? Well, no, he's not that either. The Scriptures don't present him in that way. In fact, the story, and we stressed this at the beginning of Saul's story, the story invites us to like Saul, to take at least something of a shine to him, at least starting out. And that makes us remember his wrongdoings differently than if we hated him. If we see him as a tragic person rather than as just a straight villain, we remember his wrongdoings differently. And that's the way that David treats him. David treats him like he likes him. So, that is, let's see. Sorry? Yeah, David treats him like he's human. So, and when we talk about the whole counsel of God, what have we been given regarding Saul as God's whole counsel? Well, we've gotten this history of all of the wicked things that Saul has done. Right? That ought to be in our remembrance of him. We've also gotten some accounts of good things that he did, and we've gotten this remembrance of, particularly how David remembers him, how David wants him to be remembered, and we've seen that the prophets themselves finish Saul's story on a higher point than Saul deserves. We might think, based off of all of what we've read in 1 Samuel, that he deserves for his story to end with his body hanging from the wall in Beth-shan. And the prophets think otherwise. We might also add, by the way, that just as David has recorded this elegy to be taught to the people of Judah, the Spirit has recorded it to be taught to the rest of us. And so David's purposes extend even beyond his immediate context. It's not just Judah who's supposed to remember Saul this way, but all Israel for all time is to remember Saul this way. And if we believe this is God's word, we are to remember Saul in this way. So, all right, I've got something else that I want to do with the elegy, but that is the end of our consideration of what David is doing with the elegy. Any questions or comments on that, or any questions or comments about the way that we treat Saul or the way we remember Saul? Wayne, I see your hand. We got the microphone coming.
Yes, we keep running into this throughout the whole Bible. Mm-hmm. And it's a lesson for us to always remember. One thing we always run into is the brevity of the Scripture.
Yeah.
Which is an example. to us that, God doesn't have to tell us every detail in order for us to gain lessons and an applicable lesson to our lives today.
And to learn His will for us.
And that's basically what we lack, is all the details. We don't have the full story. So we don't know how many good deeds he may have done. He may have done lots of things that and we don't know about them. But we know about these things that God has written because they are lessons to us.
Yes.
That we should. A lot of the Bible is put into a not but scenario, where it's not this but that. And so it's presented to us. Remember this because I want you to do this and not that. And so the Lord's will is always present in the Lord's law. That's why we call it the law, the old law, because this is the law. And so we gain law out of this by reading these stories. So we have to remember it and put things in that context.
Right. Yeah, these have been recorded for our benefit. And you mentioned, the good things that Saul did. And it's one of the frustrating components of his character is that we see him doing some of these same things at the same time. So, for example, in 1 Samuel 28, why does he have to go into Philistine territory to consult the witch of Endor? Well, it's because he's just spent a lot of time, apparently, making a very thorough hunt throughout the land to get rid of witches. So much so that he has to go behind Philistine lines to find one. And that's, the one doesn't justify the other, by the way. But it just shows us what a frustrating character Saul was, that he could do something as righteous as driving all of the mediums out of the land, and then be so faithless as to immediately turn around and go looking for a medium to consult whenever he feels like he's in trouble. It is the best word I can come up with for it is frustrating. Why on earth does Saul act this way? So, all right. So I want us to, we have suggested that this elegy serves a double purpose in the story, just like Hannah's prayer does at the beginning of the book. In the broader context of the book, many of David's words take on a somewhat different cast. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the prophets are recording David's words ironically, as if to tell us to believe the opposite of everything that David is saying in this elegy. The book's not countering David. What it means is that the prophets are bringing David's words into a more fully rounded picture of things. And that's the double nature of this elegy. David has composed it to fit the occasion of Saul and Jonathan's death. And so he intends to address that specifically. The prophets incorporate this elegy into the book because it also addresses things outside of the death of Saul and Jonathan. So for example, David does express some general concern for Israel, but it's focused on David's here and now, and it focuses mainly on Saul and Jonathan. But the book broadens that message out to teach us about the ways of God, whom David, I don't know if you've noticed this, reading through the elegy, David doesn't mention God explicitly in this elegy. In fact, there are several things that David doesn't mention. Like he doesn't ascribe any kind of moral or spiritual goodness to Saul. I don't know if you noticed that. As much praise as he heaps on Saul, it's not Saul was a morally upstanding guy. But David doesn't mention God explicitly here. The prophets, by placing this elegy in this context, can teach us things about God, even using a text that doesn't mention God. The book also uses these words as a form of foreshadowing about David's own kingship and about the general trajectory of Israel, which is something that, again, David doesn't seem to intend here. So there's a whole lot that we could cover in this regard that would, I don't want us to be stuck on this elegy for like weeks and weeks and weeks or anything. I don't think that would be productive. But there are at least a couple of things that I want us to notice out of this. So there are things that we're going to leave by the wayside. I'll give you, since we're here at the end of the class, let me give you a couple of things that are there in the text that we simply lack the time to hunt down. And maybe that could be something for you to chew on over the course of the week. You might have noticed the oddly sacrificial language that David uses throughout the elegy, even in the opening lines. Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. Right? David's just talking about Mount Gilboa by high places, but what significance does high place have to us otherwise? Well, it's a place where offerings are commonly made. And in fact, he does talk explicitly about offerings in the high places. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, no fields of offerings. And then it gets almost explicitly sacrificial in verse 22. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Blood and fat almost always appear together in context of sacrifice. Now here, David is talking about Jonathan and Saul's prowess in battle. He's focusing on them as warriors. But he uses this language in a way that evokes sacrifice. What is he doing with that? How does that fit into the broader story that's being told in Samuel? We don't have time to hunt that down together, but give that some consideration. What could the prophets be doing with this? There's also, let's see, what was the other one that we were not going to, oh yes. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely in life and in death, they were not divided. Hannah's prayer also talks about life and death, mainly that the Lord kills and the Lord makes alive. Life and death are going to come up again in the final poetic section at the end of 2 Samuel. Life and death is one of the big themes of this book. We don't have time to chase it down together, but that's something to mull over privately. So what's the book of Samuel telling us about life and death, God's place in it, man's place in it? I'll suggest that here in the final seconds, as Craig is going to ring the bell, one thing that we have learned from David's actions and from Abigail's words is that people need to consider that they are not in charge of matters of life and death and should not put themselves in those positions like the Amalekite did, like David wanted to do but repented of. Because as Hannah declares, those matters are left in the hands of God. All right, thank you so much for your kind attention and your questions and comments this morning. On Thursday, we'll finish up our consideration of this elegy by talking about some things that the prophets do use this elegy for in the broader scheme of the book and Israel's history. Thank you.